Welcome to Get Invested on the Property Hub podcast channel, the leading weekly show for Australians who want to learn how to unlock their full self, health and wealth potential. I'm your host, Bushy Martin, and each week I go deep with the best investors, experts, leaders and founders to find out what it takes to break free from the grind, discover freedom and to live by design. Subscribe now and join me and get invested in the life that you really want. Let's get started.
Hi, friend fighters. What's happened in property over the last 12 months? What does it all mean? And what can we learn from it? How does it inform what we need to do next? Well, to help me with all of this, as part of our continuing summer series, while you're taking time to reflect and re-energise, this week I'm going to share part one of my recent chat with highly respected quantity surveyor and tax depreciation expert, Mike Mortlock from MCG, on his popular Geared for Growth podcast, where we take the time to unpack the property year that was and what we can learn from 2024 that forms the backdrop for next week's part two of our chat that will help you set up for the property year ahead and beyond. So today we start with a retrospective as we look back on property conditions and changes across the country, as we deep dive on what were the surprises and what were the influences that came out of left field. We look at what were the standouts and what were the trends that have driven property performance around the nation. Because sustainably successful investors always learn from the lessons of the past and look what the tea leaves of recent property conditions and trends are telling them before they consider their next move. And before we get into it, if you're looking to take your property investment to the next level this year in order to fast track your financial freedom, whether you're new to the game or an experienced investor, feel free to explore your why, what and how of successful property by tapping into our recently released Freedom Formula program that reveals all of the fundamental property success principles that you can digest anywhere, anytime at your leisure in just 60 to 90 minutes. And you can do this by just clicking on the link in the show notes or by going to bushymartin.com.au/Freedom Formula course. And if you'd like to confidentially delve deeper into your specific property needs, challenges and questions, feel free to book in with me personally for a one-on-one solution session by again clicking the link in the show notes, where you'll have my complete, dedicated and undivided attention to tap into my 40 years of property and finance and strategy expertise for a full 60 minutes to help you solve any and all of your property challenges. In the meantime, take advantage of all of last year's learnings as you get invested in the first part of my great conversation with the infamous Mike Mortlock.
Bushy Martin, thanks for joining me back on Geared for Growth.
Very pleased to be here, mate. I've been waiting with bated breath to get back on board with you. You're doing some awesome stuff, and with our sort of joint focus on what's just happened and what might happen, I'm pretty dressed to chew the fat.
Yeah, well, this is a two-parter, as I hopefully have said in the intro, which I will record chronologically after this. It's more than my brain can handle with only one coffee on board. But we're going to start with a retrospective. So at the time of recording, we're at the very end of November. Basically, the year is finished. When this comes out, it'll be in and around Christmas time. So a bit of a 2024 retrospective. There was some real surprises across the board. I mean, there were lots of people that were bullish on places like Perth, but surely even them wouldn't be considering a 25% year-on-year growth. What were some of the standouts for you?
Well, I reckon I'd sum up 2024 in two words, they being supply and affordability. I reckon is really, really the core. And drilling down a little bit further than that, Mike, when I say supply, I mean listings.
Yes.
And affordability, because it's very much that story. And I think if you look around the country at what's happened, those areas that have done well are the ones that have got very low listings. I mean, listing levels, as you would know better than I, between 20 to nearly 45% less than the long-term average. And if you apply that around the traps, couple of things there. It's put a bit of a floor under prices in some areas where the listings have been low, but in the areas where there's been at or above listings, then those areas have tended to perform pretty averagely. So, you run the measuring stick around the country,
The areas with more listings, like Melbourne, Hobart, Darwin, and a lesser degree Canberra, no surprise, haven't performed so well. In fact, Melbourne's gone back nearly 2%. Hobart, we're only just underwater, but they're holding their breath.
Yeah.
Whereas those limited listing growth areas like Perth, Adelaide, and Brisbane have performed extremely well. But that's only half the story. So I think that's put the floor on it. It's the great levelling affordability catch up
Yes.
that I think has really created that feeding frenzy that we're seeing, particularly in the West and good old Adelaide. That's, I've always said, being an Adelaidean, that we've been the Stephen Bradbury of property over the last couple of years, because we've been in the doldrums for a long time, and all of a sudden it's sort of come to the fore. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think there's a series of I guess converging trends that are started to create that. And again, I like to join dots where there aren't dots, which can be dangerous. But I think there's sort of 6 critical mass tipping points that have occurred over this last 12 months that's almost created a perfect storm for performance in those areas that we've just touched on. And I'll briefly touch on those, Mike, because I think firstly, we've seen a much bigger shift towards reliance on getting our information from social media than we have the mainstream media. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I think it all comes back to that black hole of trust, where we don't believe politicians, we don't believe the mainstream media. We're tending to go towards single source and direct to source communications, like podcasts like this, where people want to hear directly from the horse's mouth, not interpreted by someone else. So there's been a much stronger focus on social media platforms generally, but given the algorithms that sit in behind it, then the more you see of this, the more you see of this. So it tends to silo and reinforce those exercises, which leads to another trend that I'll talk about in a second. The other, I think, is because of that trust issue that we now have, there's a much bigger reliance on data to make decisions. So we've gone, in my crusty old years in the game, Mike, I've gone from zero information on a highlighter in the newspaper on a Saturday morning to so much data that you almost confused by it. And I think buyers agents have cherry-picked and taken that to their advantage to some degree, which I'm going to return to in a second. We've also got that affordability concentration that's happening at the same time. So borrowing capacities for most people are down, they're being constrained. That's pushing property buyers into fairly tight price points at the affordability end. So, 650 down. All the fish are swimming in that pond. Once you start to get above that threshold, the numbers diminish pretty strongly. So we've got everyone focusing in on that price point, if you like. And then the other thing that I think COVID has helped us with is that we've gone to borderless buying. So pre-COVID, everyone was backyard. Post-COVID, given the lifestyle exodus that a lot of us have taken advantage of, and the opening up of the digital world and the ease with which we can access information to look at properties anywhere, suddenly we're much more comfortable buying a sight unseen property in another state. So that has certainly helped the equation. We've talked about limited supply, but the other thing that I think, and probably a cautionary note here, Mike, I think we're seeing the rise of very high profile, self-professed expert buyers agents and industry influencers that have big audiences. They talk very confidently in their delivery. They dazzle people with data, and sadly, some of that data is a bit self-justifying. And as a result, we've got these feeding frenzies happening in areas like Perth and Adelaide, because relatively to the East Coast, they look extremely cheap. We've got all that focus on it, and what's happening is that buyers agents and their clients are fighting each other in an area where there's very limited listings And no great surprise, we're seeing price rises as a result of that. So I think it's almost, if I was to draw an equivalent, it's almost like the market-making activity that we see in the share market, where big institutional funds with lots of money and volume can drive prices up and down. We're tending towards a similar situation in the property market now, given the convergence of all of those things that I spoke about. That means that those hotspot feeding frenzies, I mean, you can almost arbitrage this if you're an investor who's smart enough to recognise where the high-profile market-making buyers agents are going to go next, and you get in there first, you can ride the wave. But if you come in at the end of that, and I'm seeing a lot of people that are still buying in Perth at a time when I think we're pretty much close to the peak.
Yep.
And you and I have been in the industry long enough to know that areas go through their cycles. We get 2 to 5 years of strong growth, and it normally comes back 5 to 10%, and then quite often it'll go sideways for a considerable period of time.
14 years, there was a flat period for Perth, wasn't there? So, I mean, even if it jumps another, say, 10% in the next 12 months, are you prepared to ride 14 years of no growth from there and compare that to buying anywhere else? I mean, that's what people got to think about, right?
100%. And we probably won't talk about it in this episode, but in the next episode, we'll talk a little bit about the influences that are likely to impact on property in the next 12 months. I would be very nervous about following the herd. And I often refer to them as momentum investors. So there's a lot of people who are using that confirmation bias to get to the party late. And that extends the tail of the growth to a certain degree. But that's normally when the fuse is about to burn out. So it's the old story. If you're hearing about an area everywhere, it's generally too late.
Yeah, exactly.
And, I think that's exactly what we're seeing in those sorts of areas. Those that got into Perth 3 years ago, and we've actually helped a number of investors get into Perth 3 to 4 years ago, and they've done exceptionally well because they have ridden the curve. But I'm talking to them now and saying, don't expect this growth to continue. In fact, we're likely to plateau for a period not too far away, and don't expect to get the sort of growth you've enjoyed there elsewhere, because what I think we're now in a position is that you can almost throw a rug over the average median price of property in every state. Hobart's a bit below the barrier. Darwin is below the barrier, but everywhere else, there's not much daylight between the average property prices now in WA, South Australia. Victoria is actually almost wooden spooner now, would you believe?
It's crazy.
Who would have believed that 3 years ago? But there's some inherent opportunity that comes out of that. So I think there's some pretty interesting times. And if there was one thing I would suggest to people listening into us today, is be very wary of high-profile market influences that have particularly businesses, and it's not just buyer's agent, because I'm a big fan of buyer's agents, by the way. I think a really good buyer's agent adds a lot of value to a property transaction. But it's like any industry that's in its early growth phase. Finance broking was no different when I started in broking back in the noughties. Every man, dog, woman, and child became a broker. So you could be a panel beater last week and a broker this week, and that sort of told you how much knowledge you had. Very similar thing is happening in the buyer's agency space, because there's very low areas to barriers to entry, and those that can grab the data, get the data to tell the right story, and they talk a very convincing story. But if you apply a very convincing story to a pretty average piece of property, then sadly, those people who bought those properties don't find out for 5 or 6 years that they bought a lemon.
It's funny, isn't it? Because you talked about the transition between us, say, going to mainstream media for property advice. And I think you and I have been around long enough and interviewed by journalists enough to realise, well, the story's already written before they speak to the experts. They're just trying to backfill with content and shove it into their narrative, right? A lot of it is absolute garbage. There's plenty of good journalists out there, but for every good one, I think there's 2 or 3 bad ones. So, it makes sense that we look to go straight to the experts, or we go to the Facebook forums to get a lot of this information. But, I notice with certain things that sort of fit almost within my area of expertise, and I'll sort of say, look, I actually wouldn't want to comment on this, and it's actually illegal for me to do so because it's construed under accounting advice, even though I'm a tax agent. But you'll get other people that chime in and go, oh, do it like this, or no, I would do it this way. I'm like, and you sort of have a look at them and you go, oh, yeah, you work in procurement, or you're a plumber. I'm like, it's a quagmire out there for advice, right?
Totally. And we just need to get back to some basics here, I think, Mike, because you're absolutely right. There's some self-professed experts that were, instant overnight. And a big red flashing light for me, if you're looking at, and let's take the buyer's agent space as an example. If you're talking to a buyer's agent who didn't exist pre-COVID, who has a massive business now and a very big social media profile, I'd be extremely nervous because they're very good at quoting growth figures, and anyone with a pulse would have done well in property post-COVID. You'd have to be in a very bad state to miss out on some pretty solid growth, given that sort of tide floated all ships. So you've got to go back to some basics and look beyond very short-term growth to long-term performance, and get nitty-gritty about who you're dealing with. What's been their investment strategy? How many properties have they bought? How have they performed? Let me talk to some of your clients that have been with you long term, so you're not just taking it on face value. There's some pretty basic things that you can do here, but also I'm a massive believer in having a totally independent property team working with you, and the main benefit of that, as opposed to one-stop shops where they're all tickling each other's back, is that you actually get some robust discussions out of that. You'll get disagreements of opinion from one to the other, and it's out of those disagreements and that robust discussion that an investor can then decide on what's in their best interest, not someone else's. And given the vested interests that are attached to some of that, it's a trap for new players that I think people need to be focusing more on.
Yeah. I mean, wouldn't it be gold to have, say, a buyer's agent, a mortgage broker, an accountant, all arguing the best strategy for you as the investor? I mean, very rarely that kind of conclave happens, but I mean, that would be where the magic is, right? I guess it happens, between emails here and there, and I think we should do it that way, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of people don't consider a team like that. They don't consider themselves the CEO of their property investing business, and they need to engage the people in the right positions to get the best results. But, expertise, expertise is worth
you
paying
nailed
for.
it.
Yep.
You absolutely nailed it right there, Mike. I think, we're constantly saying to investors that we're assisting that you are the manager of your managers. So you need to invest in your knowledge enough to know when those managers are pulling the wool over your eyes. Don't outsource it completely and use the excuse that you're too busy to then hand over your financial future to someone else. You really do need to take some time to educate yourself, and then you can sort the wheat from the chaff when you're talking to a professional who might be pushing a certain line because it's to their benefit. I know with the investors that we work with, we actively have those hard discussions. We will jump on a Zoom call with the key players and thrash it out, because at the end of the day, it's the investor who needs to make a decision on what they're comfortable with. But if they don't understand the ins and outs of both sides, how can they make an informed decision?
Yeah.
So I think there's a big opportunity there, and sadly, Mike, a part of what we do now from our business perspective, it's a part of the business that's arisen not because we want to, but because we've seen a need. We now provide what I call the sort of secret service agent role, protecting our investors, because yes, we'll help them with the strategy and the finance piece, but if you leave them to wolves in terms of the professionals that are doing a great hat and cane routine on a really good story, but putting them into a pretty average property, then we've positioned ourselves as the John West of property, where it's the properties that we now reject on behalf of our clients that make sure they actually end up getting the best. And we can synthesize and do the due diligence on the stuff to look through the jargon to find out what the real parameters are to decide whether a property actually fits the bill. So, and that's purely arisen out of a clear need, not a desire. It's not an area of the business that we want to, but part of that now is for us to educate
investors on what they should be looking for and how to sift the rubbish from the dross from the gold, so they can then actually make a better formed decision. And eventually we'll work ourselves out of a job with that so that they're in a position where they can manage their managers and get the right result.
Yeah, teach a man to fish sort of thing. There
Spot
was
on.
there was three things that I sort of picked up from the intro with yourself. One is, the danger of where we're getting our information and the qualification of buyers agents. I want to share an anecdote where I sort of put this question to industry people maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I sort of said, aren't some buyers agent businesses big enough now where they can move into a market and actually move the needle? 10 or 15 years ago, I was told categorically no. Nobody's got enough volume to really do it. And if it's an area that has a reasonable population, it's very negligible. I think we've reached that time where it actually is quite meaningful, so much so that I don't have proof of this, but I believe it is a strategy for some buyers agents, especially the ones that they know others will copy, right? Because you've got to think, let's say there are buyers agents that'll do 50, transactions a month plus, like maybe as high as 100. You could put 1,200 people into a location over a year. Now, you would want to be client number one, not client number 1,200. But I guess they guarantee that 1,200 is going to do okay anyway, because they know they've got these clingers on that will follow them. I think that's a really interesting thing to look at.
100%. And you're probably in a better position than I am because I've got anecdotal evidence based on investor experiences of that. To give a quick example, Mike, there's when we're assisting investors and keeping the buyers agents honest, we'll go in and we'll talk to local property managers, totally independent of the transaction, that have nothing to do with it, because a good property manager will, if they've lived in the area long enough and they've been managing properties for long enough, they've got and they can communicate well, and they are around, then they're going to give you the truth of what's currently happening and what has happened and where it's likely to go from that perspective, because they're seeing it every day of the week. And I won't talk about location because I avoid the whole market making activity myself, because as soon as you talk about a spot, everyone wants to pile into it. Yeah. But let's just say an area in regional Queensland, we were talking to a property manager and she said, you wouldn't believe this, but we've had 50 people ring us this week asking the same questions, who are all sitting on a podcast / webinar with a buyer's agent.
Right.
Now, if that ain't market making activity, Mike, I don't know what is.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? And I think Perth has really given people a hit of some sort of drug that they're now searching for in other locations. Like I saw people straight away go, all right, well, what's the next Perth? It's Melbourne. Everyone's talking about Melbourne because Melbourne suffered. It's amazing what happens when you introduce these minimum standards in a poor way. You tank the economy and you collect more debt than every other state combined. You mess up the games, and then you put in this 10-year land tax levy and you wonder why investors exit and the market's going in the toilet. But of course, people are thinking, well, this is possibly the time to get in because there's zero heat. But then also people now looking at, well, Darwin's done nothing for a while. Is Darwin the next Perth? I'm like, yeah, if you get the timing right, like maybe Darwin will do 30% in the next 2 years, but what's it going to do for the next 10 years? And how does that compare to other ones? Do you think people are drunk on the sugar hit of getting into that hot market?
100%. You nailed that, Mike, because I think
a great morning, Bushy.
Yeah. You're always on fire, Mike. We know that. The reality is, I think, that we're seeing a generation of people who've suddenly discovered property post-COVID, because everyone, equity investors, everyone's gone, holy hell, property's going gangbusters. I need a piece of that. They jump on board, and their experience of property has been what they've seen over the last 4 years, not over the last 40 that I'm probably showing my age now that I've been playing with. And the danger there is that you do chase that growth, because if we boil it down, Mike, and there's a couple of really key points that you've touched on here. One is the investment horizon, and the longer you invest, the less location matters, because every area would generally return to the mean and I'm talking 20 years plus. I think Jeremy Shepard has actually done some data diving on that proves that over a 22-year period, all areas will perform similarly on an average capital growth rate. And if we look at what that average capital growth rate is, over the last 45 odd years, doing some data research myself, we're seeing the average capital growth vary from about 5.5% through to just below 7%. And that's still good, by the way, because if you're holding a property long enough, then you can still do extremely well on that. But we've seen people jump into these areas of getting double, triple those sort of growth rates, and it's just not sustainable. So there's going to be a big reckoning here, not too far away. And while, I love Perth, and I've got a brother who lives down at Margaret River. It's a beautiful part of the world. And yes, there's been some diversity that's been built into the economy over there, but there is still a fairly strong reliance on the underlying support of the resource sector. And if there's any trepidation or speed wobbles that happen in that sector, and that may well be on the horizon, given the Trumponomics impact that has just hit the US, then I think some people are going to be in for a surprise, and we need to lower our sights a little bit to, well, what is the true long-term average, and are we happy with that? And if we are hanging on long enough, then these sugar hit areas are just an annoying interference and a bit of market noise that's getting in the way of the fundamentals of what property is actually about.
One of the points you mentioned in the beginning was affordability, and I would categorise even maybe 2023 and 24 as the rise of affordable markets. I mean, you look at Perth; it was second after Darwin in second last place for median house price. Now it's mid pack approaching the top, and I think we've seen top of packs come back, especially Canberra, who for some reason is always between Sydney and Melbourne, because I think everyone's overpaid there. It's too cushy. But you sort of mentioned the point 650,000 or below is that sort of sweet spot. Interestingly, last time we crunched our data, that was the average purchase price for every property investor that came through our system. Now, if you remove outliers, because I remember there was someone bought an apartment for $1 or $2 million, and that finds its way into the data and can have a little bit of an influence. But it actually probably drops about 100K if you remove some of those outliers. So it begs the question, well, where do you go to purchase investment properties at that price point? And it's not those traditional markets that we talk about being blue chips, the Sydney and the Melbourne. It was Brisbane. Brisbane is maybe a different story now, but it certainly was Perth, and Adelaide would qualify as well. And interestingly, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, probably in that reverse order, have been the performers this last year, right?
They have, absolutely. And I think when you start casting the net further afield than that, you're then into regional areas. I guess this probably shifts us to where I think people need to be focusing on, because the data dump that people are drowning in at the moment, it's a lot of rear view mirror stuff. And that can be pretty dangerous, as you and I know. Trying to fly a jumbo jet using a rear view mirror and a dashboard that's giving you information from 3 months ago, that's a pretty scary concept. What needs to shift, I think, is a focus on forward-looking data. And again, I don't like generalising too much, because that's got its own dangers attached to it, Mike. But if moving forward, the focus shouldn't be on double-digit growth every year. It should be on what are the fundamentals underpinning the growth, the likely growth of property value in a particular location, and is there enough critical mass there to protect that property in that location if and when there's downturns in one sector or another. So I often talk about the 3 I's. The new committed infrastructure that hasn't happened yet, might have started, but it isn't finished, is a key driver. And we're talking highways, roads, rail, technology. Then we're talking about new industry diversity.
So we're talking about areas that have got at least 3 or 4 very strong growing industry bases, because there's a lot of talk about interest rates affect property and population and migration affects property. The real underlying driver is economic performance. There's no question about it.
Or jobs, another way of putting that, right?
It is jobs. If you follow the jobs, if you want to keep property pretty simple, follow the jobs, because the infrastructure will be there. The industry growth is associated with it. They're pretty closely interlinked. They sort of feed each other. And the third component that supports all that is strong and growing incomes. So if there are strong and growing incomes in that location that people can afford to keep paying more for property, then that's going to allow the property growth to occur if there's also that scarcity element that's associated with it. So I mean, it's not rocket science, but to outsource your financial future to someone on the strength of sugar hit growth that you well coined, I think it's a really dangerous philosophy, and we need to be getting back to the basics and looking at what the fundamentals are of future growth through the 3 I's and some other supporting elements, rather than chasing what's hot on the latest podcast or webinar.
Exactly. I mean, definitely tune into part 2, which will be coming up in a minute of this one. We don't want to, we don't want to cannibalize the listeners, but we're here for broad commentary, not like where you've got to buy in 2025 is X, unless I'm ruining your next bit. Another thing that you spoke about was supply, and interestingly, 2024 has all been about supply when you talk to politicians. The type of supply they're talking about is not the type of supply that you talked about, which I think is actually much more meaningful for price movements, and that was the supply of listings. But the politicians have been talking about the supply of housing. Of course, the National Housing Accord's goal to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years, well, that started 1 July this year, and gosh, aren't we off to a hell of a start? Yeah. What do you think about supply? Because, I mean, obviously we're not building enough. I think politicians don't consider property investors as a type of supply, i.e. 91% of private rental accommodation is people like you and I providing that. The government is really out of that kind of business. But there's definitely been a fixation on supply from politicians. And for me, 2024, one of the key things, if we were going to categorize what happened, is political intervention. A lot more than I would have anticipated, and a lot more at the state rather than the federal level. Federal, we had rhetoric about, capital gains tax exemptions and negative gearing is maybe back on the agenda. I got punished by journalists for modelling Albo's investment property in Dulwich Hill and Copacabana and how much negatively geared he would be. That was sort of a crazy couple of weeks. But how do you think that influence has played out in 2024?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of political rhetoric around the whole housing affordability rental crisis debate because there's a couple of things. Every politician and every person in media knows that everyone lives in a house. Therefore, if you've got nothing else to talk about, let's keep people scared with the issues around housing, because everyone's going to have an interest in it. We all live in something with a roof over our head of some description, whether we're freehold, whether we've got a loan on it, or whether we're a renter. So mass appeal, and I'm going to be a little bit jaundiced here because I've sort of got frustrated with the fact that it's top of the debate, but the cut off your nose to spite your face, short-term reactive band-aids that they want to throw at these things are actually going to make things worse, not better, Mike. And it's the reason why I think private investors in particular have been villainised is that we're a silent majority. We're not a collective voice. We don't have a strong lobbying call. It's very easy to paint us as rich, greedy baskets that are, making hay while the sun shines at the expense of renters. That ain't the case. The biggest issue that we now face, and no government's going to admit to this, is when government pulled out of the provision of public housing back in the 70s, early 80s, and relied on the private sector to do it. And spot on, 91% of mum and dads are really at the heart of housing supply. And appropriately at the time, they incentivised them with capital gains and negative gearing, because if you're going to buy a losing business and it's going to lose money for every year for 20 years, you want to have some kick in the tail to make it worth you even doing that. No one else in the business would do that if there wasn't some incentive to at least cover some of the costs and then have some sort of return at the end of the journey. But it's become expedient to point the finger at us as a result of that. And I think some of the issues here will be resolved if government actually stopped throwing money at it and pointing the finger at the private sector. Because the private sector, I've said this a number of times, Mike, if we're in business, we have to make a profit to survive. Not enormous profit, but enough profit to keep feeding the team and keep feeding ourselves. Now, if we're relying on the private sector to provide housing, and there has to be a profit motive there to actually be survivable, then we're always going to have a just after time supply model. Because you're not going to flood the market with properties and then lose money on a transaction. It's never going to happen if the private sector is relying on doing it. They're not charities. So I think at some point in time, and again, this won't be popular with any government, but they do need to step back into the arena as far as particularly the affordable housing piece is concerned, and provide that floor for those that fall below the line. And that is going to happen, and they still deserve to be looked after. But until that occurs, all the rest of the talk and the sort of knee-jerk reactive Band-Aid solutions that are actually going to make things a whole lot worse than they are better is not going to go away. But I also think there's a lot of political speak, because given the length of our government cycles, they don't really want to solve the problem. They want to be perceived to be solving the problem. But they also, if they were to solve it, given that, I think it's 54% of our personal wealth resides in our homes. If there was any drop in the value of those homes, that's going to put every government out. So I think we've got some systemic issues there that we'll keep talking about it, and it makes great talking on the nightly news and the headlines on the front page of the rag. But and they'll play with the edges and toy with a few bits and pieces and do some stupid things, I think, in the meantime as a result. But all of those things, we've only got to look as far as New Zealand in recent times, when the previous government there made some changes to capital gains and negative gearing, and surprise, they've reinstated them now because it turned into a walking disaster in terms of housing provision and supply and property values. So I think it's a bit of a circular argument, Mike, until someone's got the fortitude to step into the arena and take some real action on this conversation, which started back when Australia was first colonised, mate. There was the housing affordability and rental crisis then. Yeah. I don't see it changing anytime soon.
But don't worry, we've got 2% deposits coming, so that'll fix everything. I don't know why you're so pessimistic, Bushy. Okay, the future's looking bright, and
let's just throw more demand in the equation. And without supply.
That's just the perennial policy. Anyway, you got to shake your head sometimes. I think that's probably a good time to split this one. Thank you for joining me for episode 1 in the year that was. Or have you got one more point?
One final comment that rounds this out.
Good.
I'd sound a little bit jaundiced with some of those commentary. The good news here is that is all good news for investors, every bit of it, because the shortage isn't going anywhere. That means that where there's scarcity, there's opportunity for investors. So happy days ahead.
That is a good way to transition. Thank you very much, Bushy, for that one. And we'll see you soon for episode 2.
Thanks for tuning in to Get Invested on the Property Hub podcast channel, your home for property investment insights and inspiration. Make sure you subscribe to Property Hub for free. Get your weekly dose of Get Invested inspiration, along with every episode of Realty Talk, Australia's top online property show for red-hot property investing news and insights direct from industry leaders and influencers. And finally, I'll see you next time.